term painterly refers to the application of paint in a loose or less controlled manner, resulting in the appearance of visible brushstrokes within the finished painting. This was made popular in the Impressionist movement, for example, this Sargent painting of Monet painting in a garden. My first tip for creating the painterly style is not to overblend your brushstrokes. Allow the colors to exist side by side. I think our tendency is to create perfect blends between colors, but that doesn't always work for a painterly style. This broken color technique can be used to imply rather than explain. We have to allow the viewer to do some of the work. One reason I love gouache so much is that it dries really fast. So when I layer lots of colors, it's easy to allow them to exist side by side rather than have them bleeding and blending into each other like they might do with watercolor, for instance. With gouache, you can touch a tiny amount of color into your mix and change it just ever so slightly, and then touch that on the paper and repeat that throughout the painting. And it makes it easier to layer up these painterly brushstrokes. My second tip is to focus on accuracy of light and color rather than just form. Or in other words, try to see the shapes in the entire scene and how they relate to each other rather than individual objects. By looking at the scene as a whole and understanding how atmosphere plays a role in what colors we see, we can start to achieve a more painterly effect, rather than if we had simply copied a reference photo and tried to do a photorealistic painting. Those are two very different techniques and approaches. So one way you can get more familiar with how atmosphere plays a role, and this is what the Impressionists did and were famous for, is to go outside and paint. And although we don't all have amazing epic landscape views, you can still see, even in a cityscape, how distant elements will appear a bit more desaturated. Oftentimes they're a bit more blue. And you'll also see various colors within shadows that photographs just don't capture. So learning how to mix these subtle nuances of color in the shadows and in the distant elements and in the landscape in general is really going to contribute to a more painterly style. When I'm back in the studio painting from reference photos, I use the knowledge I've gained outside to inform me in my decisions in the studio. So even if you don't always paint outside, it's still going to really benefit you in future paintings. My final tip is to leave some of the areas a bit more abstracted. Think about ways you can group similar items, especially if they're far away or not in our focus area. Take trees or a large field, for instance. Instead of painstakingly painting every single leaf or blade of grass, we can group them or clump them together into similar shapes. I will often cluster together my trees or bushes or various things in the distance, and then I'll layer up some dry brush strokes using various colors to sort of mimic the variety you would see in real life. And again, this is why gouache is great for this, because you can achieve that broken color effect really easily and quickly with just a few brush strokes. The funny thing about the painterly style or impressionist style is that at first glance, it might look like it was achieved in 5 seconds because it has that loose quality. But in reality, it takes years of practice and repetition to get it right. And part of that comes from the understanding of color and value in the landscape, which takes a lot of time in itself. So if you're just starting out, I urge you to study these fundamentals in addition to having fun with your painterly style techniques. Okay, that's it for this little study session. I just want to remind you all that I have tons of step-by-step tutorials over on Patreon, and I also have a lot of gouache videos here on YouTube. I'll put links to both in the description. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I'll see you again next week. Take care.